This session is Lifecycle of a Phone Fraudster, Exposing Fraud Activity from Reconnaissance to Takeover Using Graph Analysis and Acoustical Anomalies. And your speakers are Vijay and Raj. Thank you.
Great. Hi everyone. So today we're going to be talking about the rise of phone fraud, as well as what is behind these fraudsters who go from account reconnaissance all the way to account takeover. I'm Vijay Balasubramaniyan, that's Raj Bandyopadhyay, and Telvis Calhoun is sitting right in the middle. You can't see him, he's invisible. With that, I'm going to jump right into what we're going after. The fact is that as institutions and organizations have invested a lot in online security and network security, what has quickly become their weakest link is the phone channel or their call center. And banks and financial institutions talk about as high as 30 to 80% of all their 4 billion fraud starting off with a phone call. So it's a pretty significant problem. So in order to investigate this problem, we looked at data from these call centers. We looked at about 105 million calls coming into call centers that belong to financial institutions, telcos, retails, utility companies, and even state benefit programs. When we investigated this, what we're going to show you is exactly what is the profile of these fraudsters, what is their mode of operation, how sophisticated they are, and it's going to be quite a surprise on the levels of sophistication that they have. And finally, we're going to talk a little bit about the defenses. One, from an acoustical standpoint, how you can look for anomalies in a call to identify the fraud as it happens, or the account takeover as it happens. And more interestingly, we're also going to talk about how, by looking at how these fraudsters are probing these accounts, you can actually predict when these fraudsters are going to take over an account. And in this case, we're going to show you how we can do that 16 days before the actual account takeover itself. So everyone is aware of phone fraud, starting from Matt Honen's epic hack where the call centers of Amazon and Apple revealed his complete identity to a bunch of fraudsters, and then they took over his account. And this goes all the way to, celebrity swatting incidents, including Ryan Seacrest, where people called 911's call center and told them that there was a bunch of armed men walking into Ryan Seacrest's house, which essentially sent a SWAT team, right? And so what this all is leading towards the fact that there's an entire new wave of call center fraud. And this new wave of call center fraud is coming with an entirely new set of sophisticated tools that these fraudsters are using. In particular, the reason why a lot of this fraud is becoming more and more significant is that the telephony infrastructure is not at all protected. Everything is based on trust, and the fact that simple things like identity, which is provided by caller ID or ANI. ANI is a more sophisticated form of caller ID. It stands for automatic number identification. Both of them are easily spoofed. I actually have an app on my phone called Caller ID Faker, with which you can pretend to be anybody's, you can pretend to take on anybody's phone number, and that's a picture of Caller ID Faker. You can also, mimic a woman's voice and do all kinds of things. So with this, what's also happening is call centers don't have very much protection on their end, because the call center agents, all they have is the phone number and what they call knowledge-based authentication questions. Things like, what's your mother's maiden name? What's your social security number? What's your date of birth? And one of my favorite calls is this fraudster calling into this call center, and when the call center agent asked him, what's your mother's maiden name? His answer was, my dad married thrice, so can I take 3 guesses? And the call center agent actually allowed him to take 3 guesses. His last one was Smith. He got into the account, wire transferred $97,000 to a bank in Cambodia. So it's a pretty significant amount of fraud that's going on in call centers. And because organizations have focused on their online and network channels, they've completely forgotten about the phone channel. So in order to understand this, first let me tell you a little bit about what happens when you make a call into an 1-800 number that belongs to a financial institution or a telco or a utility company. The first thing you interact with is what is known as the IVR, or interactive voice response. This is where the bank will say, hello, welcome to this bank. Please punch in 1 to speak in English or 2 to speak in Spanish, and then goes on to ask you for your account number, potentially your social security number. It's a completely automated system, and you can interact with it either via key presses or by speaking into it. If you're like me, you're constantly pressing 0 or 9 to get to a call center agent, and that's when the call gets transferred to the agent. And this is where you actually have the content of the call. So when you look at the two parts of the call, you have the initial portion which comes into the IVR, which just contains the phone number and call records associated with that phone number. And then when you're speaking to the agent, you actually have the audio content. And and this is where they ask all the knowledge-based authentication questions, right? And what we did is we analyzed 105 million calls that started off at the IVR and went all the way to the call center agent. These 105 million calls were originating from 18 million different phone numbers, were accessing 12 million different accounts. And now for the reveal, right? What we found is that 1 in every 2,900 calls coming into these call centers is actually fraudulent. With that 105 million set, that's about 30,000 fraudulent calls in just that set itself. What we also found is it takes about 5 calls for the fraudster to take over an account. What he's doing in these 5 calls is doing things like changing your email address, changing your physical address, changing your phone numbers on file, so that if the bank or the telco or the utility company tries to reach back out to you, they're reaching the fraudster himself. And on the 5th call, they're actually able to do damage, financial damage. So they're able to do wire transfers, they're able to order plastic. In the case of retailers and e-tailers, they're able to order a replacement camera on behalf of you. And in all, the total amount of losses in these 105 million calls was about $59 million. This $59 million roughly translates to about a little over 50 cents per call, which means there's about 10 billion calls coming into the US call centers. The amount of fraud is pretty humongous. We also were able to identify about 228 different fraud gangs within these calls. And we'll talk a little bit about how we identified these fraud gangs. But first, we'll talk about what these fraud gangs are doing. What is their mode of operation? So if you look at the sophistication of these fraudsters, I'm actually a fan of The Godfather. And if people here remember The Godfather, there are rings to the mafia. It starts off with the soldiers or the soldatos, then goes on to the capos or the captains, and then you have the Don, right? Don Vito Corleone. So with that said, we found fraudsters also having similar levels of sophistication. What they're doing is a variety of things. One, the first thing that they're doing pretty effectively is what's known as ANI, or phone number deception, right? One of the things that we talked to you about was things like caller ID spoofing or ANI spoofing, where you can use some app to spoof phone numbers. But they're going a step further. What they're also doing is hiding behind well-known voice over IP gateways. So, for example, if any of you have received a call from a Skype phone, you get a pretty popular number that comes on your caller ID. It's 667-238-0240. That's a pretty standard number for Skype. So if you look at just a single day of calls coming from a Skype phone, you'll find in this call set itself about 1,500 calls. Hidden within these 1,500 calls are 7 fraud calls every single day, on average. And so they're doing a lot of hiding behind voice over IP gateways. They're using a lot of prepaid phones. So these are all techniques in the category of deceiving the phone number so that you can get through the first line of defense for many of these organizations. They're also doing a lot of knowledge-based authentication deception. What that means is they know answers to a lot of the questions. And we've heard fraudsters who are essentially flipping pages off a credit report or some data breach that they've managed to access, some kind of report by which they know which address you were in before you were married and things like that. So they actually have a full-blown knowledge of all the questions that the organization asks and have answers for that. In addition, we're seeing that they're also doing a lot of voice deception. So they're disguising their voices. So for example, when a male fraudster is trying to access a woman's account, he actually increases his frequency. And you can, we're going to show you an example of that. And when they do it wrong, they actually sound like Alvin the Chipmunk, really, really high-pitched. And when they do it, when they go the other way, they actually sound like Darth Vader. So we have two separate categories of fraudsters, the Vaders and the Chipmunks. And so there's a lot of voice distortion that happens. And finally, there's a lot of reconnaissance and social engineering, where the first three parts, three deception techniques are purely where they engage with call center agents. The reconnaissance is actually happening at the IVR. So when you talk to an IVR, essentially one of the questions that this automated system asks you is for your social security number. Now, you punch in the social security number correctly, it'll say, welcome Mr. Vijay Balasubramaniyan, the account balance on your bank account is $37,000, right? And so if you punch in the right social security number, you'll get the name and the account balance to a particular account. If you punch in the wrong social security number, the interactive response unit will say, sorry, that was the wrong social security number, and will ask you to try again, or after several tries, kick you out. What these fraudsters are doing are mining for social security numbers. They have a list of social security numbers, and they're going one after the other, and as soon as they hit the right social security number, not only do they know the name on the account, but the actual account balance. And what they're doing, a lot of this activity, this reconnaissance activity, is performed by the soldiers. Once they get these accounts, they're then farming over these accounts to the dons. The higher value accounts go to the dons. And the way we've actually categorized these three different categories of fraudsters is by the number of accounts that they're taking over. So where the soldiers are typically targeting 1 to 5 accounts, the captains are targeting 5 to 50 accounts, and the dons are targeting 50 to 500 accounts. So I'm just going to quickly run through what techniques each of these fraudsters use. As you can see, the dons have a lot of sophisticated techniques under their arsenal. We also find a lot of emotional distress that they cause to the call center agents. So we find that they both flirt with call center agents as well as get mad at them. So we have one fraudster known as the Mad Russian, who every time he doesn't get accepting call center agents, starts screaming. And we've had call center agents who would actually reveal all the account transactions on a particular account to him. So with that said, now to delve a little deeper into the analysis that we did analysis on two parts of the system. Like we said, there's one, the IVR part, which is the automated response part, and then there is the audio analysis, right? And so we're going to first talk about the audio analysis and what you can find out there. This is a little part of the defense part of the talk. And then we're going to talk about the CDR analysis, where then you can start predicting these attacks even before they happen. So where the audio analysis helps in identifying zero-day account takeovers or account takeovers by repeat fraudsters, the CDR analysis actually allows you to do things like in the minority report, where you can identify pre-crime. In this particular case, 16 days before the actual account takeover, you can actually see which accounts these fraudsters are probing. So with that, let's jump into the audio analysis. So the first thing I'm going to show you is what are we looking out for. So a lot of the calls that we're going to play to you are calls of the extreme variety. What I mean by that is this is where the audio artifacts clearly show you something is wrong. When you have sophisticated audio algorithms, you can actually detect these audio artifacts at a much lower level. But the first call that I'm going to show you is one where this caller is actually calling from a voice over IP system. So this is a call coming out of Nigeria using a Skype phone. It's going through, they've hacked a PBX in UK called Magrathea, and it's going through that. So you can listen to the call. Look for breaks in the call, and I'll tell you exactly what you can do with those breaks.
I apologize. I'm having a little bit of a hard time hearing you. Are you on a,
No, I'd like to know the available credit in my account.
Got it. Your available credit's $34,999.
$34,999?
Yeah, $34,999.
Okay. Okay. Could you help me up my main address today?
Update your address?
Yes, sir.
So that's a call where he was trying to change his billing address. He successfully changes his billing address and comes back in again and takes over. But if you heard, it's very hard to hear him. And in fact, the call center agent at the very beginning says, I'm having a difficult time hearing you. That's because he's going over a voice over IP network with a lot of packet loss. If you actually look at his call and deconstruct his call, you see there are two graphs there. The first one actually shows the call audio, and there you can't really see the packet loss as clearly. But if you plot what's known as the short-term energy of the graph, you can actually see the packet loss breaks jump out at you. And these short-term energy, I mean, energy is like anything else. When there is nothing happening, the energy drops down to zero. So that's what you're seeing here. Every time there is this break, the energy drops down to zero. So the fact is that you can actually look at those energy breaks and immediately identify the call went over a voice-over IP network. No landline will ever produce this kind of an artifact. No cell phone will ever produce this kind of an artifact. So this short-term energy not only tells you that the call went over a voice over IP network, but the length of the break actually tells you what kind of voice over IP network. So the fact that we know it's a Skype call is largely because each of these networks encodes a different amount of your voice into a packet. So some of them encode 10 milliseconds, some of them encode 20 milliseconds, some of them encode 30 milliseconds. And if that packet gets dropped, you have a break of that length. And so you can actually start detecting not only which voice over IP network the call went over, but also exactly the voice over IP network and its packetization parameters. So you can completely detect the type. This is a call where we did a sting operation with some of the IRS scammers. So we somehow got the IRS scammers to actually engage with us. So this is one of our, one of our employees actually interacting with them. This is the IRS scam. So when you're listening to this call, listen to the hum that you hear every time. So these are people who claim to be from the IRS from within the US. But you can hear this hum, and I'll talk a little bit about the hum as soon as the call is over.
I'm still trying to find out who I'm dialing. I didn't make out the message.
Department.
I'm sorry?
Federal Investigation Department.
Federal Investigation Department?
Yes.
Okay. I mean, is this part of the IRS or something, or state?
This is a legal department working for Internal Revenue Service.
Okay. What do you mean by legal? I mean, you got me here a little nervous, so I'm trying to find out what's going on.
So at the very end, I left the hum in so that you could hear that. I mean, this is a 40-minute call. If any of you are interested, it's on Pindrop Security's website. It's a pretty fascinating call, but you can hear the hum all the way through. When we analyze the hum, this is one of the features we look out for. You can actually figure out that the hum, in particular, has a 50 hertz impulse. And that's because this is in a place where the electrical grid is actually interfering with the calls. So what's happening is it's coming from a country that has 50 hertz. As many of you know, the US is not one such country. India is very much a country. As you know, you identify a lot more of these characteristics, we actually were able to determine the origin of this call to be India. And so this 50 hertz hum, and in particular frequency characteristic actually tells you where the call is coming from. In addition to the hum, you can look at other characteristics too. What kind of frequencies are in a call? Because different networks allow and disallow certain frequencies. They cut off frequencies because of bandwidth constraints. So with that said, that's the technique we're largely using. These are acoustical anomalies. So we have about 147 such acoustical anomalies, and they're broken into different categories. You heard the loss category, and in addition to packet loss, we're looking at robotization, dropped frames, and a bunch of other characteristics. There's also frequency characteristics, which is what you heard. We have a whole bunch of codec artifacts that come into those categories. There's also noise characteristics. So every device actually introduces a very specific noise. And the reason it introduces a noise is when you had analog phones, you had ambient noise in the call. Once you moved to an all-digital system, you didn't have any noise. So what would happen is you would think the person on the other end hung up. So all these devices introduce comfort noise. It's a ksh kind of sound, which is always there. And that ksh kind of sound is very particular to different devices. So we look at all these characteristics and create essentially a phone print for the device. And what we've found is this phone print actually uniquely identifies a device. Over 12 million different phone devices, we've found no collisions in the phone print, which means they're a very good indication of the actual device. In addition, you can actually identify the type of device. So is it a landline? Is it a cell phone? Is it a voice over IP device? And if it is one of these categories, you can actually even subcategorize. So you can look for Skype phones or Google Voice phones in voice over IP device, or TuiTalk, which is a device used only by fraudsters in the Mexico, Colombia, and Tunisia region. And if any of you are interested, we can talk about why exactly they're using that voice over IP device. In addition, you can actually start determining coarse-grained geographies for the call. So we're able to determine geographies the size of France. So that allows us to say, this call's coming from within the US, from within, the East Coast, the West Coast, or it's actually coming from Nigeria or India or some such place. So with that said, in the data set, now that you have all these features, you can actually identify even more information. So the first thing that we were able to identify is what's the distribution of fraudsters. We found a large majority of fraudsters are coming from international location. About 52% of fraudsters are coming from international locations. And there's no surprise here, because if they're calling from international locations, they don't have to face any of the US laws. So they can completely do caller ID spoofing, completely remain anonymous as long as they're able to get into these accounts. So a large majority of them tend to use, come from these international locations. The other part of it is they're using a lot of voice over IP services. And the reason they're using voice over IP services is, like I mentioned, they want to come across these voice over IP gateways, but also it gives them another level of anonymization, as well as the ability to spoof any phone number. In particular, in terms of where we find maximum amounts of fraud, we find West Africa, and in particular Nigeria, the #1 place where these fraudsters come from. Coming in a close second is Eastern Europe. That's Russia and Romania. And then coming in after that is Latin America with Mexico and Colombia. And then you have Philippines too. You see that the UK is also highlighted. That's because a lot of the fraudsters from Eastern Europe and Nigeria actually use UK PBXs, including PBXs from the service provider called Magrathea, that's the one we've identified, to actually route a lot of their calls. And they do this because that gives them another level of anonymity to actually make a call. So with this, what does our system do? What our system does is composes anomalies to identify when you see new fraudsters, and then it creates phone prints and voice prints and phone number profiles for these fraudsters so that if they ever come back again, you can then identify them. So to give you an example of some of the anomalies, let's say you get a call from 404-385-1234. If you query telco databases, which is what we do, you can actually identify that this is supposed to be a landline in Atlanta. It's a working telephone number. It belongs to this person, and it's never been ported in the last 6 months. And then you compare it with the audio characteristics, and you immediately see that the call is actually coming from a Skype phone from Nigeria. Something is very wrong with that call. Immediately you know there's an elevated risk on that particular call. Again, another anomaly that we look for is if we find the same 147 characteristics of the phone print on calls that are accessing multiple accounts. Why is that same phone print accessing 20 different accounts? There's something very strange with that. So that's a little bit of the anomalies. And once we identify these 147 characteristics for these fraudsters, we can then immediately identify them if they ever come back again. And we'll show you a little bit of how we identify them when they, for example, change their voice. So with this system, what we're able to do is separate out the good calls from the bad calls. So a little bit of that, what this graph is showing you is if you build this system, the green line is actually showing you all your good calls. So a majority of the 105 million calls fall into a bucket where you can clearly identify them from having very different acoustical characteristics from the set that are fraudulent, and the set that are fraudulent are in the red. So you see there's a clear separation. In fact, if you place a score of 60, you can actually split it such that you can identify 80% of the fraudsters who have scores higher than 60, and then 99% of the legitimate people who have scores below 60. So you can actually create systems like this based on these acoustical characteristics. What's more interesting is that you can actually start creating fraudster profiles. In this particular case, this is a fraudster, and he's trying to access a male's account. So let me play that.
Thank you for calling. This is... How can I help you?
I would like to update my billing address, please.
Of course. May I have your name and account number?
Yeah, my name is Rick Anderson.
So
and my account number is...
Do you have your card with you?
Yes.
There are 3 digits on the back of your card near the signature line. Can you read them?
So this call, he's trying to access a male's account. It's Rick Dash. When you plot the 147 different characteristics, that's what it looks like, right? If you normalize all the different values and you look at it. Now I'm going to play you another call, which is, someone trying to access a woman's account.
Thank you for calling. This is how can I help you?
Can I get my account balance, please?
Sure, Amanda. Who's calling?
Yeah, my name is Amy Cartman.
Okay, and what's your account number?
I don't have it with me. Can I use my social?
Yes, of course you can. What is your social?
My social is...
This sounds like a woman, but it isn't. It's actually the same fraudster. And if you look at their their phone print, you can see we've overlaid the 2 phone prints, so there's certain voice distortion that's happening due to which you can actually see the difference in the phone print. But what we realized is these fraudsters are actually changing their pitch frequency using a tool called Screaming Bee by 25 hertz, and these are very well-defined APIs. So what we did is we took the fraudster who sounds like a woman and constantly downshifted his frequency by 25 hertz, and we're going to play you what that sounds like.
Can I get my account balance, please? Can I get my account balance, please? Can I get my account balance, please?
Can I get my account balance, please? Can I get my account balance, please?
So that's the same fraudster as the first fraudster. So if you shift it down by 125 hertz, you actually get back the original fraudster. And that's the point. A lot of these guys are using voice distortion. In many of these cases, we're actually able to see, for some strange reason, they use 25 hertz and they always change it. One of the things that we did find is there's an API for voice distortion, and its default value is 25 hertz. So we think that has something to do with it. Ultimately, you can create these phone prints and start creating clusters. And that's how we're able to identify gang activity. So you look at all the calls, overlay them on top of each other, and if they're more related, if you give them a higher red color, that will mean they're more related. If they're blue, they're less related. So based on that, we've gotten all the calls, and you can start seeing red pockets forming, and these are the individual gangs accessing on each call a different account. And so you can start identifying these fraudsters. So we were able to identify 228 different fraudsters using this. So with this, you can clearly see that these fraudsters are really sophisticated. They're using voice distortion, they're using anti-deception, but you have certain defense mechanisms because these fraudsters are calling from all over the world. The world has very different audio characteristics, and that reveals itself in the call. But this is still reactive, and this allows us to catch the fraud when it's happening. The next part of the talk is going to talk a little bit about how do you identify this even before the attack. So with that, I'll hand it over to Raj.
Hi. So in this part of the talk, I'm going to talk about how we can use CDR analysis or metadata analysis to actually predict fraud before it happens, to predict which accounts have been targeted for fraud. So what is CDR data? CDR stands for call detail records. This is all the metadata that has been collected by different organizations when they receive phone calls. They include different kinds of information. For example, in that table you can see that's a sample of CDR data. You have the source and destination phone numbers. You have the start and end time of the calls. And then you can have additional information depending on the application. For example, the IVR exit column there tells you at what point in the automated menu the user left the IVR to either a call center agent or just hung up the call. But you can have even more details. You can track the individual steps of the IVR. If that call gets associated with an account number because the user has entered a valid number, a valid PIN, or a valid social, then you get the account number there and so on. If it's a cell phone company that's collecting CDR information or calls, then they might add the base station, signal tower information, and so on. So there's a lot of information there in these CDRs. So why are these CDRs interesting? Here's a picture that might help give you some intuition around it. This is a graph, a network picture based on some sample data from those 105 million calls. It contains the dark blue circles are source numbers and the hollow circles are destination numbers. There's an arrow pointing from a source to destination if the source has made a call to that destination. Already from just this really simple structure, you can see some patterns emerging. For example, at the very bottom, you can see a pattern that's very commonly associated with spammers or telemarketers. A single source number calling a very large number of destinations. That's usually suspicious, and then combined with other features, we can nail down that, oh, these guys are spammers or telemarketers. The other interesting one is what we call premium rate fraud or traffic pumping. It's a form of traffic pumping. This is characterized by a single destination that is getting calls from a large number of sources. And what happens here is that a fraudster or a fraud gang create fake premium rate services, which are like paid, toll numbers, and they create these numbers, and then they spoof calls with numbers belonging to a telco, like they'll spoof calls from valid AT&T customers, and they'll make calls to that premium rate number to basically drive traffic to that number. AT&T or that carrier will pay the telco, which is the premium rate number, some money, and then they'll try to claim the money from the customer and then realize that that's fraud. That was a fraud call. So basically, since the fraudster controls both ends of the call, they actually end up pocketing the money. So this is the kind of fraud that telcos have to face, and that's characterized by this kind of pattern. So you can see that even from such simple structures, you can actually come up with interesting patterns that can capture these kinds of behavior. So overall, in CDR analysis, we have three major steps. The first step is to convert the CDR data into features that can be put into a model. These features are numeric features, and we categorize them into three kinds that we'll talk about in a little more detail: reputation, velocity, and behavior. So once we represent calls in terms of these features, we can train a machine learning system, or what's called a classifier system, with features and labels. Labels are something we get from our customers who have fraud teams, and they label certain calls saying, oh, these calls are fraud or these calls are genuine. So we can use those labels combined with the data, the raw data, the features, to train a model to learn to distinguish between real fraud from genuine calls. And then once you have a model that's trained, we can use that model to predict fraud over new calls. So that's the overall algorithm or the architecture of a CDR analysis system. So what are these three categories of features, and what are some examples of these? So reputation is the simplest one. It basically tells us what do we know about a phone number. What we know about a phone number, we can look up in a telco database are the carrier of the number, which carrier it belongs to. The device type, is it a landline, cell, VoIP? Are there any complaints associated with that number in both public databases as well as private ones? So all these together form reputation features. Velocity basically captures trends in the way the number behaves over a long period of time. Some of those velocity features are the ones that we talked about when I showed the graph. It's like how many destinations has that source number called. In addition, there are also timing features we can take into account. For example, what is the average interval between the calls from a number, between calls from the same number. And then finally, behavior are basically what is a caller doing in the space of a single call or in a call surrounding a single call. This can be the sequences of steps the caller takes through an automated menu, even the interval between the key presses in an automated menu. That can also tell us interesting things. So why did we decide to classify or categorize our features into these three categories: reputation, velocity, and behavior? So this table will show, give you an intuition for that. This is the same table as I showed originally with the CDR data. You can think of reputation as looking at the single number that's highlighted in the orange box. So what do we know about the number? Velocity is basically looking down the rows of the table. So basically, what is that number doing over a long period of time? And then behavior is sort of looking at the columns of that table. So basically, what is the number doing in a single call or in a space of few consecutive calls? So basically, it gives us reputation, velocity, behavior together give us a very complete insight into CDR data and allows us to slice and dice it in every which way to extract all the information from it. So at this point, I'm going to walk through a concrete example of how each of these features can be useful. And hopefully that'll give you an intuition for how these features contribute to overall fraud detection. First, reputation. One of these numbers is not like the others. And when you look at them, you can probably not tell. They all look like valid phone numbers. But in fact, the second number, 404-203-1234, is actually invalid. Why? Because 404-203, that number block has not been allocated to any carrier by the FTC. As an end user or as a call center agent, there is no way you'd know that. But we keep track of that kind of stuff. And that's why when we get a call or our customers get a call from an invalid number like this, we can immediately raise a flag. And that's an example of a reputation feature that can be very, very critical in indicating fraud. But then there are a lot of other features like, is a number a prepaid number, or is it VoIP? Is it, what carrier is it from? So some carriers are more associated with fraud than others. So all of those together can add to reputation features. So let's look at velocity. Velocity, remember the premium rate fraud we talked about, the traffic pumping fraud, where fraudsters create fake premium numbers and pump traffic to it? Those can very well be detected by velocity features. In particular, one of the things that fraudsters do when they implement premium rate fraud is try to find valid customers of a telco so that they can actually claim to be valid customers for that. They spoof numbers for valid customers. And the way they find valid customers for the telco is something called anti-scanning or phone number scanning. They will try a series of numbers in sequence or close to a sequence, spoof those numbers, and then figure out which one of them belong to that carrier or that carrier. So the way we managed to catch this kind of traffic pumping was basically design a feature to actually detect that kind of scanning. And the way we did that, to give you an intuition, was take a sequence of numbers and figure out basically how many numbers shared a common prefix. And that was there's some math behind that, but that alone could capture separate a very large portion of the premium rate fraud. What that graph shows is that basically that feature, which is on the x-axis, separated a huge chunk of the green dots, which are the premium fraud, from the others. Overall, combining those, that particular feature for phone scanning along with other velocity features, we could detect 80% of premium rate fraud at a false positive rate of 1%. And this is important, up to 10 days before actual fraud calls. So we could detect up to 10 days before fraud calls that a certain number, a certain premium number, was actually fraudulent. So that's an example of how velocity can actually help you to predict fraud. How does behavior help? The place where behavior helps really has a high impact is actually detecting reconnaissance in the IVR, detecting when a fraudster is trying to mine an automated menu system to extract information. So here's an example of, the table shows an example of a set of calls that our model identified as being part of reconnaissance activity. So this is a set of calls of 7 calls made, consecutive calls from the same number, made within 1 hour. The first 5 calls were made in the first 7 minutes, and the 2 calls were made about an hour later. And what this caller did was basically try to enter account numbers. So try to enter an account number, fail, wait for a while, try to enter another account number, fail, and so on. Doing that 10 times with 10 different account numbers, ultimately getting an account number that worked, entering the PIN number that worked, and then getting successfully listening or getting the balance of the account. So basically, what we can estimate is that the fraudster has a series or a list of account and PIN numbers that they have gathered from somewhere, and they're just trying those until they hit one. And when they hit one, they actually manage to get a lot of information about the account. They can get the name on the account, they can get the balance, and so on, and they can decide what to do next. So when we throw in behavior features, we are able to detect 46% of accounts that have been targeted for fraud. We have been able to find reconnaissance activity on those at a false positive rate of about 2%. We'll talk about that later. In some cases, up to even 2 months before actual fraudulent calls or transactions on the account. So that's, again, a very interesting result. So what's the overall result for detecting IVR reconnaissance? As I said, I mentioned that we have a 46% detection rate. That means we can detect suspicious activity or alert on suspicious activity on 46% of accounts targeted for fraud at a false positive rate of 2%. Why is that interesting? There are many, many applications or many, many ways that you can try to predict fraud or try to predict reconnaissance and so on. But all the ways so far, all the methods that have been tried so far suffer from one problem. That is, they have very high false alert rates. And they're so high that it makes it very hard to actually use the system. What this kind of curve, which is called the lift curve, lets us do is to take a model and tune its parameters and see what are the different operating points a model can work at. What are the different false positive rates and true positive rates you can get by using this model and tuning its parameters. And then based on the application, the client, the organization can decide, we want a false positive rate of no more than 2%, so we're going to pick this particular operating point. So this is a very powerful way that machine learning gives you, a powerful tool to actually come up with models that have, low false positive rates, but, high true detection rates. And in this case, on average, we could detect this probing activity 16 days before an account takeover, an actual fraud incident. To go into a specific case that we found, we had basically, here's a case where we detected recon behavior 33 days before fraud. So we detected some suspicious activity similar to the one that I showed on August 30th. On October 2nd, there was $1,361 that got stolen from that account. And then the customer filed a complaint with the organization about 10 days later. And then the organization finally verified that fraud and incurred a loss about a month after that. So you can see the value of having a solution like this, which can actually flag beforehand something saying, hey, this particular account has been targeted for this kind of reconnaissance activity. So if you get a call associated with an account, especially one trying to withdraw money, just watch out, do something special, try to prevent that, do something. So this is how we can actually use CDR data to predict fraud and actually get an idea of which accounts will be targeted for fraud way before it happens. I'm going to transfer to Vijay to summarize our presentation.
Yep. So the key takeaways are, the fact that we're finding, call centers are the weakest links. That's what a lot of the organizations were claiming. After analyzing 105 million calls, we agree with that assessment. There's a lot of fraud happening, where these gangs are spoofing customer phone numbers, like we said, distorting voices, so you heard the chipmunks as well as you heard the waders, and they're probing voice response systems. And the probing is particularly interesting because in online security, like Raj mentioned, the large reason why you can't identify probe activity is because of large false positives. So that's why you're always stuck in this range of zero-day attacks or being reactive after the zero-day attack. But if you are able to start looking at this probe activity, because fraudsters are trying to get into accounts, right? So if you're able to look at this probe activity, you can actually identify this well before they're actually trying to take over the account. And we showed two systems, one which uses acoustical anomalies to detect the fraud as it happens, and does that at a pretty high detection rate. And then the CDR analysis, which can detect half of the fraud at least 16 days before it happens, so something like pre-crime. And those two in tandem seem to work really, really well in identifying this fraud, because these fraudsters are really, really sophisticated. So with that, we conclude the talk. Thank you for your time, and we'll open up to questions.
This time gap between when the different stages of the fraud occurred, is that a deliberate strategy to avoid arousing suspicion, or are there other reasons for them to stagger the phases of the fraud out?
Right. We think it's largely because there are different people who are involved in doing these different stages. So where we find these soldiers trying to get information about the account, they pass that information. There seems to be some kind of a queue. And what we find is that the people who are, so we name each of the dons. We named it along with our, with the organizations. So we have a don whose name is McGruff, West African McGruff, Euro spoofer, and things like that. They are only handed the really high value accounts. So every account they target has $200,000 in balance or more. And what's more interesting is each of those accounts are really, really old. So they belong to account holders who have birthdays in the 1950s or the 1940s. So, there seems to be a very deliberate process of providing these account information to the more sophisticated fraudsters.
So it just takes a while for it to work its way up the chain?
Yeah, there's a queue, right? There's just like a queue. It's probably some center in Nigeria where you go hand over all these things.
So the ones that, do you find the high value targets take longer to work their way up the chain?
That's a good question. We haven't looked at that. I mean, that's a great question. I think we will go back and take a look.
In other words, conversely, if you had somebody who was, smaller and it was a smaller account, it would be one of the lower level people who would take it right away. But then, the VIPs with a lot of money would take a while.
Yeah, and also in order to make like when we find these dons attacking these accounts, where they actually bring down the average. So when they call in, within a couple of calls, they wipe out the account. So, they have prepared so well for an account that they know all the answers. So, like I said, when this guy was asked what was the address before you got married, he took a pregnant pause. You could hear him flipping the notes. And then he said, that's 7 years back. How do you expect me to remember that when I don't remember to wear my pants? And then he immediately, gave the address, right? And the call center agent let him. So I think there's also a little bit of doing all the information gathering for an account, which will probably take longer for the higher value account. So, I think that's a good thing for us to find out. Yeah, the highest value account, just for people to know, the smallest loss in this data set was about $800, and the highest loss was about $700,000. So they actually wired $700,000 from a home equity line out, and so that was a shocking call to listen to. But yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you for the nice talk.
Okay.
I have one question. You said your analysis was on 150 million calls, yeah?
105 million calls. 105.
Okay.
Yeah.
So even with that, 2% as false positive is too high. What do you think about it?
Yeah, our false positive rates are, with more calls, we tend to get better. The false positive rates was around 2%, but for systems where we're in the live deployment longer, we are actually able to reduce that down to 1%. But you're right, it's still a significant number. But if you look at fraud everywhere, the number of false alerts are anywhere between, for any network security system, is anywhere between 1 to 5%. So you will find, it's one of the, it's the nature of the beast.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. So just to repeat his question, I know people asked me to do that and I forgot. His question was, is 2% a high false positive rate? Absolutely, it's higher than 1, it's higher than 0.5. We'd love to be there, but that's where the system is right now. There was a question here. Yeah, that's a great observation. So that's true for financial institutions, absolutely. So what the gentleman said was that with financial institutions, when you change things, it takes a while for them to take effect. Question there. Sorry? Yeah, the question is, one of the things was the 911 swatting incident. So given, that you can detect voice over IP and services like that using a solution such as ours, why aren't these implementing faster? We've had organizations like municipalities contact us, but they move slow. So, it takes time. Not to be disparaging, but in the government things move a little slower than other places. Any other questions? I think there's a question there.
Now that this technology exists, do you find that fraudsters catching on and changing their vectors of attack and adapting to this strategy?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things is that we found, like the fraudsters, when they were originally just like the Nigerian gang, which we call West Africa one, when they started off, they were directly making calls through their call center and, using spoofing techniques. But sometimes, if you're not careful enough, you actually will reveal certain things in the headers. That's the reason they started using these additional networks, like hacking PBXs in UK and routing calls through Magrathea and things like that. But the interesting thing with audio characteristics is it's like quicksand. The more you try to do something very different than what a legitimate customer does, the more you actually reveal yourself. So we're still, you're absolutely right, it's a cat and mouse game. So we're still trying to see, we're researching attacks that can beat systems like ours, but it's a constant cat and mouse. I don't know, because in places where the system is implemented, one of the things that you can verify is how well is the system doing, because if someone's losing money, they're obviously going to report it back to the organization. So we've still not found a depreciation in the effectiveness rates of the solution. So, but we're continuing to do research on how they can beat the system. So, but you're right. There's always going to be fraudsters are going to try to beat the system.
Thank you.
Yep. So his question, I'm doing this in an awful, yeah, okay, got it. The mic is fine.
How common is this technology deployed in banks and other, how common, is this a new thing? Has this been around for a while?
Our technology has been around for about 2 years. So it's relatively new, but we are deployed in a couple of the largest banks in the US, a couple of the largest brokerages in the US and things like that, but it's not widely adopted. There are other technologies like voice biometrics and using network characteristics, and voice biometrics and network characteristics have existed, voice biometrics has existed for the last 15, 20 years. Network, looking at the SS7 network and things like that, has also existed for a similarly long period in time. So they're there, but their effectiveness rates vary. And with things like voice biometrics, you need to get a voice print for the fraudster. So you need to take that first hit and then create a voice print and hope to God that that guy doesn't distort his voice, or if you're in India, it has a population of 1 billion people. I'll get the guy down the street to do my bidding. So, there's a little bit of that. So, yeah. I think I answered the question.
I was about to ask about the effectiveness of voice biometrics. But
no, I mean, yeah. So voice biometrics for sure is effective, right? So what we find is, because we also use voice biometrics to profile them, in places where repeat fraud activity is significant, and in certain cases it is true, it's as high as 70% in certain cases, we do find it effective as a technology.
Thank you.
Yep. But yeah, it's not a silver bullet. There's only lead bullets here, yeah. Any other questions? Great, I think we finished 5 minutes before our talk, so thank you very much. You've been a great audience. Thank you.